What America's most dangerous prisoners eat every single day. Subscribe, like, share and comment for more videos. The tray arrived at 5:47 a.m. Untouched. That alone should have been enough. At ADX Florence, food is never refused. Not really. Not by men who have learned that the tray, a pale rectangle of processed carbohydrates, a scoop of something beige, a small carton of milk, is the only clock they have left. The only proof that time is still moving. When a prisoner stops eating at ADX, experienced staff know what that means. Not weakness. Not protest. Something else entirely. Something calculated. The officer who noticed it first was a federal correctional officer with over 11 years inside the facility. His name has been withheld from public records, but his incident report, filed February 2019 and later obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, described a pattern so precise, so deliberate, that it should have triggered an immediate response. It didn't. Instead, it sat in a queue. ADX Florence sits on the edge of Fremont County, Colorado, surrounded by nothing. That's the point. There are no neighbors close enough to hear anything. No windows that face outward at ground level. No sunlight that arrives on a prisoner's terms. It is not designed to punish through pain. It is designed to punish through silence. The 400-plus inmates here, many of them the most dangerous federal prisoners in American history, live in cells measuring approximately 7 by 12 feet. Inside that space, they eat, sleep, shower, and exist. Each meal is slid through a slot in the door. Each tray is identical to the one before it. At ADX, the food is not meant to be good. It is meant to be consistent. Consistency, the philosophy goes, removes leverage. It removes desire. It removes the ability to want something badly enough to trade for it. What the philosophy underestimates is what happens when a man stops wanting the tray altogether. The breakfast that arrives every morning at ADX contains roughly 2,800 calories spread across 3 meals. The exact composition rotates on a standard institutional cycle: oatmeal, bread, a protein element, fruit when the contract allows it, a dairy portion. Nothing is seasoned beyond basic preparation requirements. Nothing is presented in a way that acknowledges the person receiving it. For context, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, transferred to ADX in 2019 after his federal conviction, receives the same tray as every other inmate in the facility. The man who once commanded a narco empire worth billions, who had private chefs, who had compounds stocked with food flown in from other countries, now eats what the kitchen sends. So does Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the surviving Boston Marathon bomber, convicted in 2015 and moved to ADX shortly after. So did Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, until his death inside the facility in 2023. The tray does not know who is holding it. The officer's report from February 2019 was not about El Chapo. It was about a different inmate, one far less famous, but whose behavior inside the facility had quietly concerned staff for months. The report described a man who had, over the course of 14 days, begun eating only the carbohydrate portions of his meals, leaving the protein, leaving the dairy, leaving anything that required sustained digestion. This is not normal starvation behavior. Inmates who are protesting eat nothing or eat erratically. Inmates who are sick eat poorly. But inmates who are selectively removing specific macronutrients from their diet with that level of consistency across that many days, that is a pattern with a very specific explanation in correctional medicine. It means someone is preparing their body for something physically demanding. The officer flagged it in his report. He listed the dates. He listed the specific items left untouched each day. He noted the inmate's demeanor, calm, cooperative, showing no outward signs of distress. He recommended the inmate be evaluated by medical staff and that his behavior be cross-referenced with any recent communications. The report was logged, categorized as a routine wellness flag. No evaluation was scheduled. In the weeks that followed, the same inmate began refusing his 1 hour of daily recreation, the single hour when ADX inmates are permitted outside their cells, alone, in a concrete enclosure barely larger than the cell itself. Refusing recreation at ADX is unusual. Not unheard of, but unusual. The 1 hour outside is, for most inmates, the most mentally significant part of the day. Surrendering it voluntarily suggests either profound psychological withdrawal or deliberate physical conservation. The officer filed a second report. This one used stronger language. He described the refusals as systematic. He described the dietary pattern as still ongoing. He noted that the inmate had, in that same period, made 2 unusual requests through the facility's internal request system, both denied, both logged, neither escalated. What were the requests? That detail, buried in the supporting documentation, would not surface until much later. ADX operates on a philosophy of extreme isolation precisely because it houses men who have demonstrated, repeatedly, that they will exploit any gap in a system. These are not men who acted impulsively. These are men who planned, who waited, who understood that patience is a form of power that cannot be confiscated. The facility was built with that in mind. What it was not built to account for, what no facility is fully built to account for, is a warning that looks, on the surface, like nothing. A skipped protein portion. A declined hour of concrete and fluorescent light. A request form, denied, filed away. In March 2019, a correctional supervisor reviewed both of the officers' reports during a routine audit of wellness flags from the previous quarter. He noted the pattern. He agreed it was unusual. He authorized a medical review. The medical review was scheduled for the following week. 3 days before it was set to take place, something happened inside that unit that nobody had anticipated. And when investigators pulled the food service logs, the actual records of what had been distributed, what had been returned, and what had been documented over those 41 days, they found something that changed the entire shape of the story. The inmate wasn't the only one who had changed his eating pattern. He wasn't eating alone in the way they thought. The logs told a story that the cells were designed to make impossible. But the cells had missed something. The logs showed 41 days of data. Nobody had read all 41 days until now. At ADX Florence, every food tray is tracked. Not casually, systematically. Each meal distributed is logged by unit, by cell number, by time of delivery, and by what is returned. The return tray matters as much as the delivered one. It tells the facility's food service contractor what was eaten, what was refused, and what needs to be flagged for nutritional compliance. It is, in theory, an airtight system. In practice, it depends entirely on who is reading the numbers. When the supervisor pulled the full 41-day record, he wasn't looking for a conspiracy. He was doing paperwork, closing out a wellness flag so it wouldn't appear unresolved in the next federal audit. What he found instead was a second pattern running parallel to the first. 3 cells over, in the same unit, a different inmate had made nearly identical dietary adjustments, beginning not on the same day, but exactly 6 days later. As if on a delay. As if responding to a signal. The 2 inmates had no documented contact. At ADX, that is supposed to be impossible. Understanding why requires understanding how ADX isolation actually works, and more importantly, where its edges are. Inmates at ADX do not share meals. They do not share recreation time. They do not pass in hallways or sit in common areas. Communication between cells is structurally discouraged through sound dampening, cell positioning, and strict protocols around any verbal interaction. But ADX is not a silent facility in the way most people imagine. Sound travels through ventilation systems, through plumbing, through the low-frequency vibration of concrete walls that, despite everything, still connect one cell to another at the most basic physical level. Inmates at Supermax facilities have, over decades, developed communication methods that exploit exactly these gaps. Tapping patterns through pipes. Timed sequences through ventilation openings. Systems so subtle they register, to an untrained observer, as nothing at all. The facility knows this. It has always known this. The question was never whether communication was happening. The question was what was being communicated, and whether anyone was listening carefully enough to understand it. The supervisor flagged the second inmate's food records and brought them to the attention of the unit's senior officer. The senior officer reviewed them. He acknowledged the parallel. He noted that the 2 inmates were not adjacent, 3 cells separated them, with occupied cells in between, and that no direct communication pathway had been identified. His assessment: coincidence was possible. Dietary patterns sometimes clustered in institutional settings due to shared environmental factors, temperature changes, food quality shifts, seasonal variation in the supply contract. His recommendation: monitor and document. Not escalate. Not investigate. Monitor. This is where the mistake lives. Not in a dramatic decision. Not in a deliberate cover-up. In the most ordinary failure available to any large institution, the assumption that because something has a plausible mundane explanation, the dangerous explanation can wait. ADX Florence processes hundreds of wellness flags per year. The vast majority resolve themselves. An inmate was sick, an inmate was protesting briefly, an inmate was adjusting to a medication change. The system is designed to absorb routine anomalies without triggering expensive, disruptive investigations every time a prisoner skips his oatmeal. That design is rational. It is also exactly what someone patient enough would count on. By the time the medical review was finally scheduled, the one authorized 3 days before everything shifted, a third data point had emerged. A correctional officer on the night rotation had submitted a separate, unrelated note through the facility's internal communication system. It wasn't a formal report. It was the kind of informal observation that gets typed into a shift log and rarely reviewed outside of the immediate team. It noted that on 2 occasions during the overnight hours, the officer had observed what appeared to be a food item, small, wrapped in what looked like a torn portion of a meal napkin, resting near the base of a cell door in the unit. Not inside the cell. Not outside in the corridor. At the threshold. In the gap. The officer had assumed it was debris from a meal tray. Had logged it as such. Had moved on. He had not noted which cell door. That detail, the missing cell number, would later become the center of an internal review that took months to complete and whose findings were only partially disclosed. Because when investigators went back and tried to reconstruct which cell the officer had been walking past on those 2 overnight shifts, they found a scheduling irregularity that shouldn't have existed. The officer's logged patrol route didn't pass that section of the unit during the times he described. Either the log was wrong, or the officer was somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. Or someone had altered the route documentation after the fact. 3 explanations. No way, at that point, to determine which one was true. The medical review took place on a Tuesday morning. The first inmate, the one whose behavior had triggered the original wellness flag 41 days earlier, was cooperative. He answered the medical staff's questions without resistance. His vitals were normal. His weight had decreased slightly, consistent with the reduced protein intake, but not to a degree that required intervention. He was cleared. The review lasted 19 minutes. Afterward, the medical staff noted in their report that the inmate had seemed, in their words, relaxed. Not relieved. Not anxious. Relaxed, in the specific way that suggests someone who has just passed a checkpoint they had already prepared for. Nobody flagged that word at the time. The second inmate, the one whose parallel dietary pattern had been identified, was not reviewed that day. His name had been included in the authorization paperwork. But somewhere between the supervisor's desk and the medical team's scheduling system, it had been dropped from the appointment list. A clerical error. Logged as such when discovered later. But the timing of the error placed it within the same 48-hour window as the patrol route discrepancy. 2 administrative failures. Same window. Same unit. At a facility where administrative failures are exceptionally rare, where redundancy is built into every system precisely to prevent this kind of gap, 2 simultaneous errors in the same location were not a statistical nuisance. They were a message. On the morning the second inmate's missing appointment was finally discovered, a correctional officer conducting a routine cell inspection in the unit found something that had not been there during the previous inspection 14 hours earlier. It was small. Easily missed. It had been placed, not dropped, placed, in a location that suggested whoever left it understood exactly how long it would be before the next inspection. What it was, and what it revealed about the 41 days that preceded it, would take investigators the better part of 3 months to fully understand. And when they did, the detail that disturbed them most wasn't what had been planned. It was how close it had come to working. The object found in the cell was a calendar. Not a real one. A handmade one, constructed from the cardboard backing of a meal tray, marked with small indentations pressed into the surface. Not ink. Not pencil. Pressure marks, made by something blunt, something that wouldn't show up as a contraband writing instrument. 41 days. Marked off one by one. Each mark corresponded exactly to a day in the food service logs. When investigators laid the calendar next to the dietary records, the relationship was immediate and precise. Every day the first inmate had refused his protein portion, there was a mark. Every day the second inmate had mirrored the pattern, there was a corresponding mark in a different column, pressed lighter, distinguishable only under close examination. It was not a hunger strike. It was a ledger. What the two inmates had been doing over those 41 days was tracking. Not planning an escape. Not coordinating violence. Something more specific and in many ways more unsettling to the investigators who reconstructed it. They had been mapping the gaps in the facility's documentation system. Every skipped food item that went unflagged was a data point. Every flagged item that didn't produce a response within a set number of days was a data point. Every patrol inconsistency, every administrative delay, every window between inspection cycles, all of it was being recorded in a format so simple it required no materials that could be confiscated. They were auditing ADX Florence from the inside. The question investigators had to answer was, why? The answer, when it finally came together, was both more mundane and more disturbing than anyone had initially assumed. Neither inmate was planning an escape. The physical reality of ADX makes that essentially impossible, and both men were experienced enough within the federal system to understand that. What they were building was something else. Leverage. At ADX, leverage is the only currency that retains value. Money means nothing. Physical strength means nothing. Reputation, connections, fear, all of it loses power inside a facility designed specifically to neutralize those things. But information about how a system works, its rhythms, its failures, its response thresholds, that retains value indefinitely. The two inmates, investigators concluded, had been compiling a detailed behavioral map of the unit's oversight patterns. Not to use themselves, necessarily. To transfer. Through the legal mail system. Federal inmates at ADX retain limited but protected legal correspondence rights. Attorney-client communication is constitutionally protected and cannot be read by facility staff under most circumstances. It can be logged, date, recipient, volume, but not opened without a court order. The investigators' theory, supported by the timeline and later by a partial review of outgoing correspondence records, was that the behavioral map was being encoded into what appeared to be routine legal correspondence and transmitted to a party outside the facility. Who was receiving it, and what they intended to do with detailed knowledge of ADX's documentation gaps, was a question that extended well beyond the facility's walls. That portion of the investigation was referred to a separate federal team. The results of that referral have not been publicly disclosed. This is where the story becomes something larger than two inmates and a handmade calendar. Because what the internal review ultimately found, documented in a report that was partially released and partially redacted, was that the system had functioned exactly as designed, and that was precisely the problem. Every individual who encountered an anomaly followed protocol. The officer who noticed the food pattern filed a report. The supervisor who reviewed it authorized a medical evaluation. The medical team conducted their assessment. The night rotation officer logged what he observed. Each step was correct. But the steps didn't speak to each other in real time. They moved through a system built for volume and efficiency, not for recognizing patterns that were specifically designed to fall below the threshold of any single alert. The inmates hadn't found a flaw in ADX. They had found the space between the protocols. The internal review made several recommendations. Enhanced cross-referencing of food service logs with behavioral reports. Tighter integration between medical staff notes and security documentation. A revised threshold for escalating parallel anomalies within the same unit. Standard institutional language for, "We saw this coming and didn't move fast enough." Whether those recommendations were implemented in full, implemented partially, or quietly filed alongside hundreds of similar recommendations from similar reviews at similar facilities, that information is not publicly available. What is available, through a combination of the FOIA-obtained documents and reporting by federal prison oversight organizations, is the broader pattern that the ADX case fits inside. Supermax facilities in the United States house some of the most analytically sophisticated individuals in the federal system. These are not men who lack intelligence or patience or the capacity for long-term strategic thinking. In many cases, those qualities are precisely what made them dangerous enough to end up there. The assumption that extreme physical isolation neutralizes cognitive threat is, according to a number of researchers who study Supermax conditions, an assumption that has never been fully tested against the specific population it claims to contain. The men eating those trays every morning are not passive recipients of institutional control. Some of them are studying it. Ted Kaczynski, before his death at ADX in 2023, reportedly spent years documenting the facility's routines in his personal writings that were subject to ongoing legal disputes over their contents and accessibility. El Chapo's legal team filed extensive motions regarding the conditions of his confinement, motions that required detailed knowledge of how the facility operated at a procedural level. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's appeals have similarly required and produced a granular record of ADX's internal policies. None of this is secret. All of it is, in its own way, a map. The difference between a legal filing and a cardboard calendar pressed with 41 marks is largely one of method. The underlying activity, understanding the system that holds you, finding its edges, probing for its tolerances, is the same. The two inmates at the center of the 2019 incident were placed in an even more restrictive monitoring protocol following the investigation. Their legal correspondence was subjected to additional review procedures, the legal parameters of which were disputed by their respective attorneys. The officer whose patrol route didn't match his log, that discrepancy was investigated and ultimately classified as a documentation error. No disciplinary action was recorded. The clerical error that removed the second inmate from the medical review schedule was traced to a data entry mistake during a system migration that had taken place 2 weeks earlier. Both explanations are plausible. Both were accepted. What nobody could fully explain, what the internal review noted but did not resolve, was the food item found at the cell door threshold during the overnight hours. The one the officer had described as debris. The one for which no cell number had been recorded. Forensic review of the threshold areas in the unit found trace evidence consistent with food contact at 2 separate cell door bases. Neither of those cells belonged to the inmates under investigation, which meant either the officer had been mistaken about the location entirely, or there were more participants in the mapping project than the investigation had identified. That thread was noted in the report. It was not followed to a conclusion. Every morning at ADX Florence, the trays arrive at 5:47 a.m. They are identical. They are consistent. They are designed to provide nutrition without providing anything else, without providing choice or pleasure or social meaning or the small human experience of wanting something and receiving it. The philosophy is sound. But a tray returned with the protein untouched is data. A tray returned untouched entirely is a signal. And 41 trays, tracked and recorded on a piece of cardboard that shouldn't exist, pressed with marks that required no contraband to make. That is a system talking back to the system that built it. The review was closed in late 2019. The recommendations were filed. The facility continued operating. The trays kept arriving. The most controlled environment in the American prison system was mapped, documented, and partially transmitted to the outside world, using nothing but meal trays and patience. The investigation found the calendar. It never found out where the information went. If this story stayed with you, the next one goes deeper.